The Old Bailey had never seen anything quite like the circus surrounding Karen Wellington's trial. Hundreds of reporters lined the streets outside Britain's most famous criminal court, while thousands of supporters for Captain Morrison held vigil with signs reading "Heroes deserve respect" and "Justice for James." The public gallery was packed with people who had won a lottery system just for the chance to witness what many were calling the most important class-based trial in British history. Judge Helen Whitmore, a no-nonsense veteran of 30 years on the bench, called the court to order at precisely 10 o'clock. She had reviewed the evidence extensively and was prepared for what she knew would be a challenging case, not because of legal complexity, but because of the intense public scrutiny and political implications. Karen entered the defendant's dock wearing a conservative black suit, her lawyer having advised her to dress modestly to avoid appearing ostentatious. But even her attempt at humility seemed calculated and false to the packed courtroom. She kept her eyes down, unable or unwilling to face the sea of hostile faces in the public gallery. Crown Prosecutor Sarah Chun rose to deliver her opening statement, and the courtroom fell completely silent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is fundamentally about respect, duty, and consequence." Captain James Morrison was performing his sworn duty as a member of the Queen's Guard when he was verbally abused and then physically assaulted by the defendant, Karen Wellington. The evidence you will see and hear leaves no doubt about what occurred that morning at Buckingham Palace. Chun activated the courtroom's video system, and the security footage of Karen's assault played on multiple screens throughout the room. Even though most people had seen the video countless times online, watching it in the formal setting of a criminal trial gave it new weight and gravity. The sound of Karen's hand striking James's face echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. The defendant struck Captain Morrison with such force that she drew blood. Chun continued. This was not a minor altercation or a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated assault by someone who believed her wealth and status placed her above the law and above basic human decency. Simon Blackwood's defense strategy was desperate and doomed from the start. He argued that Karen had been provoked by James's silence, claiming that the guard's failure to respond to her questions constituted unprofessional behavior that would frustrate any reasonable person. "My client was seeking assistance and information," Blackwood told the jury. She was met with deliberate silence and what she perceived as disrespectful behavior. While her reaction was regrettable, it was understandable given the circumstances. But Blackwood's argument collapsed immediately when the prosecution called Colonel Harrison as their first witness. Harrison explained the protocol and traditions of the Queen's Guard with military precision, making it clear that James had followed his orders exactly as trained. The Queen's Guard maintains ceremonial silence during official duties, Harrison testified. This is not disrespect. It is centuries-old tradition that represents discipline and dedication. Captain Morrison's conduct was exemplary throughout the entire encounter. When Captain Morrison took the witness stand, the courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the court reporters typing seemed loud by comparison. James wore his dress uniform, his posture perfect, his medals gleaming on his chest. He spoke with calm precision, recounting the events without emotion or embellishment. The defendant approached my position and began making demands for entry to the palace grounds, James testified. When I maintained my ceremonial silence as required by protocol, she became increasingly agitated and began making threats and derogatory comments about my background and social class. Defense attorney Blackwood's cross-examination was a disaster. His attempt to portray James as somehow provocative or disrespectful only highlighted the soldier's professionalism and dignity. "Captain Morrison," Blackwood asked, "don't you think it was rude to ignore Mrs. Wellington when she was asking for help?" "Sir, I was following direct orders and centuries of military tradition. The Queen's Guard does not break ceremonial silence except in genuine emergencies. A civilian's desire to bypass security procedures does not constitute an emergency. But couldn't you have made an exception for someone of Mrs. Wellington's social standing?" The question backfired spectacularly. "Sir, the law and military regulations apply equally to all civilians regardless of their wealth or social position. No one is above proper procedures, and No one has the right to assault a soldier for following orders. The prosecution's case became even stronger when they called witnesses who had observed Karen's behavior over the years. Former household staff testified about her cruel treatment and impossible demands. Restaurant workers described her tantrums and threats. Shop employees recalled her entitled attitude and verbal abuse of anyone she considered beneath her station. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had spent decades treating service workers as subhuman, someone who genuinely believed that money gave her the right to abuse and humiliate others without consequence. The assault on Captain Morrison wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a lifetime of entitled behavior. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a forensic psychologist called by the prosecution, testified about the psychology of entitlement and its connection to Karen's actions. The defendant displays classic patterns of narcissistic entitlement, Dr. Warren explained. Her belief that social rules don't apply to her, combined with her lack of empathy for those she perceives as inferior, created the conditions for this assault. The most damaging testimony came from Karen herself when Blackwood, against the advice of many colleagues, decided to put her on the stand. Karen's arrogance and lack of remorse were immediately apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Under direct examination, Karen attempted to portray herself as the victim, claiming that James's silence had been deliberately disrespectful and that her reaction was understandable given the circumstances. But Sarah Chin's cross-examination exposed Karen's true character with surgical precision. Mrs. Wellington, in your statement to police, you referred to Captain Morrison as some working-class kid. Do you remember making that comment? I may have said something like that in the heat of the moment, Karen replied defensively. And when you said working-class kid, were you using his perceived social background as an insult? No, I was just describing what I observed. Chin pulled up the security footage again. Mrs. Wellington, let's watch your behavior again. Can you explain to the jury why you told Captain Morrison he was just some working-class kid who doesn't understand who he's dealing with? Karen's face flushed with embarrassment as her own words played back in the courtroom. I was frustrated and upset. People say things they don't mean when they're emotional. So you admit that you used classist language as a weapon to try to intimidate Captain Morrison? I wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. Then, why did you tell him your family had more money than he'd see in 10 lifetimes? Why did you threaten to have him fired? Why did you call him a little peasant before you struck him? Karen had no answer. Every attempt to justify her behavior only made her look worse. The jury could see exactly what kind of person she was: cruel, entitled, and utterly lacking in human decency. The character witnesses called on Karen's behalf were laughably inadequate. Wealthy socialites who barely knew her testified about her charitable donations, completely missing the point that writing checks didn't excuse criminal behavior. Their testimony only reinforced the image of an insulated elite protecting one of their own. The trial lasted 6 days, but the outcome was never in doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges: assault causing actual bodily harm, threatening behavior, and public order offenses. Judge Whitmore's sentencing statement was devastating in its clarity and moral force. Mrs. Wellington, she said, looking directly at the defendant, your behavior represents everything that is wrong with privilege unchecked by responsibility. You assaulted a decorated war hero who was serving his country with honor and distinction. Your actions were not only criminal, but morally reprehensible. The judge sentenced Karen to 18 months in prison, the maximum allowed under sentencing guidelines. But the legal penalty was only part of Karen's punishment. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore continued, I am recommending that your case be referred to the Attorney General's office for review of potential additional charges under hate crime legislation. Your use of classist language as a weapon of intimidation suggests this assault was motivated by social prejudice. The courtroom erupted in applause, which Judge Whitmore quickly silenced. Karen collapsed into her chair, finally, understanding that her privileged life was truly over. She would go to prison. Her husband faced separate charges for financial crimes. Their assets would be seized. Their reputation was destroyed forever. Captain Morrison sat in the gallery with quiet dignity as justice was finally served. He had never sought vengeance or publicity. He had simply done his duty and trusted that the truth would prevail. His conduct throughout the ordeal had made him a symbol of honor and integrity that resonated far beyond Britain's borders. The aftermath of Karen's conviction was swift and severe. Wellington Financial Services collapsed completely, with Richard facing his own trial for tax fraud and money laundering. The Belgravia mansion was seized and sold to pay outstanding debts and legal fees. Karen's conviction also triggered investigations into several charities where her donations had bought influence and positions. Within 6 months, the Wellington family had lost everything. Their fall from the heights of London society to disgrace and imprisonment became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked privilege and entitlement. Captain Morrison continued his service with the Queen's Guard, eventually being promoted to Major and receiving a commendation from the Queen herself for his exemplary conduct under extraordinary circumstances. He never gave interviews about the incident, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. The case changed British law as well. Parliament passed the Service Member Protection Act, which increased penalties for assaults on military personnel performing ceremonial duties. The legislation was nicknamed James's Law in honor of the young captain who had maintained his dignity under assault. Karen served her full sentence in Holloway Prison, where she discovered what life was like without money, influence, or the ability to intimidate others into compliance. Fellow inmates, many of whom had grown up in poverty, had little sympathy for a wealthy woman who had never faced consequences for her actions. Upon her release, Karen found herself unemployable and unemployable. Her conviction had made her unemployable in any respectable position, and her husband's financial crimes had left them penniless. She was forced to live in a council flat and work minimum wage jobs, experiencing for the first time the kind of economic insecurity that she had once mocked in others. The video of her assault continued to circulate online, serving as a permanent reminder of her moment of moral failure. Karen Wellington had become a global symbol of entitled behavior and its consequences, ensuring that her disgrace would follow her for the rest of her life. Captain James Morrison, meanwhile, became an inspiration to millions of people who saw in him the qualities that make society strong: duty, honor, dignity, and grace under pressure. His conduct proved that true nobility comes from character, not birth or wealth. The trial of Karen Wellington versus the Crown became more than just a criminal case. It became a reckoning with privilege, accountability, and justice. It proved that no one, regardless of wealth or social position, is above the law or immune to consequences. In the end, justice prevailed, and the world saw that heroes really do exist, even in an age that sometimes seems to have forgotten what heroism looks like. Captain Morrison's quiet courage and unwavering dignity reminded everyone that some values are worth defending, and some lines should never be crossed. Karen Wellington learned, far too late, that respect cannot be bought, demanded, or beaten out of people. It must be earned through character, kindness, and decency, qualities she had never bothered to develop. Her assault on a Queen's Guard had exposed not just her own moral bankruptcy, but the rot that can set in when privilege goes unchecked by responsibility. The aftermath left everyone speechless because justice, when it finally comes for those who thought themselves untouchable, is always more powerful than anyone expects. 3 weeks after the incident, the Wellington family's world had completely collapsed. Wellington Financial Services had lost 60% of its client base, with major investors pulling their funds and seeking new management for their portfolios. The board of directors had voted to remove Richard from his position as CEO, citing irreparable damage to the firm's reputation and client trust. The family's Belgravia mansion was under siege by reporters and protesters. What had started as a criminal case had evolved into a symbol of class warfare and social justice. Karen had become the most hated woman in Britain, receiving thousands of death threats and being recognized wherever she went. The family had been forced to hire private security just to leave their home. Inside the mansion, Karen paced frantically through rooms that had once been her pride and joy. The antique furniture, designer artwork, and crystal chandeliers that had symbolized her status now felt like monuments to a life that was rapidly crumbling around her. Richard sat in his study, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements that painted an increasingly dire picture of their future. "The Cayman Islands accounts are frozen," Richard said quietly as Karen entered the room. "The Serious Fraud Office launched an investigation after your arrest brought scrutiny to all our business dealings. They're examining every transaction we've made in the past 5 years." Karen stopped pacing and stared at her husband. "What does that mean?" "It means they're looking for evidence of money laundering, tax evasion, any financial irregularities that might have gone unnoticed when we weren't under public scrutiny. Your assault on that guard has opened every aspect of our lives to investigation." The revelation hit Karen like a physical blow. She had never paid much attention to the details of Richard's business operations, content to enjoy the lifestyle his wealth provided without questioning how exactly he had acquired it. Now she was learning that his success hadn't been as legitimate as she had assumed. "They found irregularities in the Henderson Trust," Richard continued, his voice hollow. "Transfers to shell companies that I used to hide income from British tax authorities. Without the political protection we used to have, they're pursuing criminal charges for tax fraud." Karen sank into a leather chair that had cost more than most people's annual salary. "How much trouble are we in?" "Prison, Karen. We're looking at prison. You for assault, me for financial crimes. And if they convict us both, they'll seize all our assets as proceeds of crime. The house, the cars, the art collection, the jewelry, everything will be gone." The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Richard answered with the weary tone of a man who had received nothing but bad news for weeks. "Wellington residence." "Yes, I understand. When?" "I see. Thank you." He hung up and turned to Karen with an expression of defeat. "That was Blackwood. The prosecution has just announced they're adding additional charges. Assault with intent to cause actual bodily harm, threatening behavior, and public order offenses. If you're convicted on all charges, you're looking at up to 5 years in prison." Meanwhile, across London, Captain James Morrison was preparing for his testimony at Karen's upcoming trial. Despite the media attention and public support, James had remained focused on his duties and maintained the quiet dignity that had made him a symbol of honor under attack. Colonel Harrison had assigned James to work with the prosecution team to ensure his testimony would be thorough and accurate. James sat in the prosecutor's office, reviewing the security footage and police statements with Sarah Chun, the Crown prosecutor who would be handling Karen's case. "Captain Morrison," Chun said, "the defense will likely try to portray you as somehow having provoked Mrs. Wellington's attack. They may argue that your silence was deliberately disrespectful or that your demeanor was threatening in some way. Are you prepared for those kinds of accusations?" James nodded calmly. "Ma'am, I followed protocol exactly as I was trained. The Queen's Guard maintains ceremonial silence during duty hours except in cases of genuine emergency or direct orders from superior officers. Mrs. Wellington's desire to enter the palace grounds without proper authorization did not constitute an emergency. The video evidence strongly supports your account," Chin said. "But the defense will try to make this about class resentment or social tensions. They want the jury to see Mrs. Wellington as a victim of an unfair system rather than someone who committed assault." "I understand, ma'am. But the facts speak for themselves. I was assaulted while performing my duties, and no amount of legal maneuvering can change that reality." Chin was impressed by James's composure and clarity. Many assault victims became emotional or defensive when discussing their experiences, but James displayed the same steady professionalism that had made him an exemplary soldier. The media coverage of the upcoming trial had reached unprecedented levels. News organizations from around the world had sent correspondents to cover what was being called the trial of the century. The case had become a referendum on wealth, privilege, and accountability that resonated far beyond Britain's borders. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for Captain Morrison and demands for Karen's conviction. A petition calling for justice for the Queen's Guard had gathered more than 2 million signatures. Vigils were being held outside Buckingham Palace, where supporters left flowers and messages of support for James and condemnation of Karen's actions. The class divide that Karen's assault had exposed was being debated in Parliament, universities, and media outlets. Sociologists analyzed the incident as a perfect example of how wealth could corrupt character and create a sense of entitlement that led to criminal behavior. Karen had become a case study in privilege and its abuses. In preparation for trial, Karen's defense team had hired private investigators to search for any information that might damage James's credibility or create sympathy for their client. But their investigation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of finding dirt on James, they had uncovered his remarkable service record, his charitable work with veterans, and his reputation for honor and integrity. James had volunteered at homeless shelters, raised money for wounded soldiers, and used his leave time to visit schools and speak to children about service and duty. The more the defense team learned about him, the worse their client looked by comparison. Conversely, their research into Karen's background had revealed a pattern of entitled behavior that stretched back decades. Former employees of the Wellington household came forward with stories of Karen's verbal abuse, unreasonable demands, and cruel treatment of service workers. Restaurants remembered her tantrums over minor issues. Shop workers recalled her imperious attitude and threats to have people fired for not meeting her impossible standards. Simon Blackwood found himself representing a client whose character assassination attempts had backfired so completely that they had actually strengthened the prosecution's case. Every attempt to diminish James's reputation had instead highlighted his virtue. Every effort to explain Karen's behavior had instead revealed a pattern of cruelty and entitlement. "Mrs. Wellington," Blackwood said during one of their preparation sessions, "we need to seriously consider changing our plea to guilty. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The public sentiment is completely hostile, and our attempts to build a defense have only made things worse." Karen refused to consider it. "Absolutely not. I will not plead guilty to anything. That guard provoked this entire situation with his attitude, and I will not be made into a scapegoat for standing up to his disrespect." Her delusion remained complete. Even facing the possibility of years in prison, Karen continued to see herself as the victim. She genuinely believed that James's silence had been a personal insult worthy of physical retaliation. The night before the trial began, Karen sat in her mansion surrounded by boxes of legal documents and evidence that would be used against her. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of protesters chanting outside the gates. Richard had moved into a hotel, unable to face the media circus that followed Karen wherever she went. Karen looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The stress of the past month had aged her considerably. Her perfectly maintained appearance had deteriorated under the pressure of constant scrutiny and the realization that her privileged life was ending. She thought about the charity meeting she had been so determined to attend that morning at Buckingham Palace. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had been on her way to a committee meeting for a fund dedicated to Princess Diana's memory, a woman who had been beloved for her compassion and humanity. Instead, Karen had revealed herself to be everything Diana had stood against: cruel, entitled, and lacking in empathy. The trial would begin at 10 o'clock the next morning. Karen would walk into that courtroom knowing that the entire world was watching, that video evidence of her crime would be played repeatedly, and that her victim was a decorated war hero whose character was beyond reproach. For the first time in her life, Karen Wellington would face justice without the protection of wealth and privilege. The British legal system, the media, and public opinion had all aligned against her. She had become a symbol of everything wrong with inequality and entitlement. Captain James Morrison, meanwhile, slept peacefully in his modest flat, knowing that he had served with honor and that justice would prevail. He had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, had served his country with distinction, and had maintained his dignity even while being assaulted by an entitled civilian. Tomorrow, the trial would begin, and the world would see whether wealth and privilege could still buy immunity from consequences, or whether justice truly was blind to social class and financial status. The stage was set for a reckoning that had been decades in the making, and Karen Wellington was finally going to pay the price for a lifetime of believing that rules applied to everyone except her. The news of Karen Wellington's arrest spread through London's social circles like wildfire. By the time her husband Richard received the call from their family lawyer, video footage of the incident was already viral on every major social media platform. Richard Wellington sat in his corner office overlooking the Thames, watching his wife's public meltdown play out on his computer screen for the third time. each viewing making him feel sicker than the last. Richard had built his financial empire on reputation and relationships. Wellington Financial Services managed investments for some of the wealthiest families in Britain, and his success depended entirely on trust, discretion, and maintaining the kind of impeccable image that attracted high-net-worth clients. In the span of a single morning, his wife had potentially destroyed everything he had spent 30 years building. The video footage was damning beyond anything Richard could have imagined. Karen's classist remarks, her threats, her entitled behavior, and, finally, her assault on the guard were all captured in crystal-clear high definition. There was no way to spin this positively, no way to claim misunderstanding or media bias. Karen had revealed her true character for the world to see, and it was ugly. Richard's phone had been ringing nonstop since the story broke. Journalists wanted comments, clients wanted explanations, and business partners wanted assurance that this wouldn't affect their professional relationships. But how could he explain or defend what everyone could see with their own eyes? At the Metropolitan Police Station where Karen was being processed, the situation was rapidly escalating beyond a simple assault charge. Detective Inspector Rodriguez had been contacted by multiple government agencies who had taken interest in the case. The assault of a member of the Queen's Guard was being treated as a serious matter by authorities who rarely involved themselves in routine assault cases. Karen sat in the interview room, her expensive suit now wrinkled and stained, her makeup smeared from crying tears of rage and frustration. She had been allowed to call her lawyer, but even the arrival of Simon Blackwood, one of London's most expensive criminal defense attorneys, hadn't improved her situation as much as she had hoped. Blackwood was a seasoned professional who had defended politicians, celebrities, and wealthy businessmen through numerous scandals. But as he reviewed the evidence against his new client, he realized that this case presented challenges unlike any he had faced before. "Mrs. Wellington," he said carefully, "I've reviewed the security footage from multiple angles. The evidence against you is quite clear. We need to discuss your options realistically." "My options?" Karen's voice was shrill. "My option is for you to make this go away. That's what we pay you for. That's what lawyers are supposed to do." Blackwood had dealt with entitled clients before, but Karen's complete disconnect from reality was remarkable even by his standards. "Mrs. Wellington, you assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard in front of dozens of witnesses while being recorded by security cameras. This isn't a case where we can argue about evidence or interpretation. The facts are indisputable. So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to focus on damage control and mitigation. A guilty plea with an expression of remorse might allow us to minimize the sentence and public backlash." Karen stared at him in disbelief. "Absolutely not. I am not pleading guilty to anything. That guard provoked me with his attitude. Any reasonable person would have reacted the same way I did." Blackwood suppressed a sigh. In his experience, the clients who were most determined to fight cases they couldn't win were often the ones who caused themselves the most damage in the process. Meanwhile, at St. James's Palace, Colonel Harrison was briefing senior military officials about the incident. The assault on Captain Morrison had implications that extended far beyond a simple criminal matter. The Queen's Guard represented the monarchy itself, and attacks on guards were treated as symbolic attacks on the crown. "What's the current status of Captain Morrison?" asked Brigadier General Patricia Wells, the commanding officer responsible for all ceremonial duties. "He's been medically evaluated and cleared for duty," Harrison replied. The physical injuries were minor, some scratching and bruising to his face. "But I've recommended he take a few days of administrative leave while this matter is resolved." "And his conduct during the incident?" "Exemplary, ma'am. He maintained his position and composure throughout the entire encounter. He followed protocol perfectly, even while being verbally abused and then physically assaulted." General Wells nodded approvingly. "I want a full commendation prepared for Captain Morrison's file. His conduct under these circumstances reflects the highest standards of the Queen's Guard." The story had already reached the highest levels of government. Prime Minister's office had been briefed on the incident, and there was growing political pressure to ensure that justice was served. The assault on a member of the Queen's Guard was being treated as more than just a criminal matter. It was being viewed as an attack on British institutions and values. Social media had exploded with outrage over Karen's behavior. The hashtag Justice for the Guard was trending worldwide, with millions of users expressing their disgust at Karen's entitled behavior and their support for Captain Morrison. The video had been viewed more than 50 million times across all platforms, making it one of the most viral incidents of the year. Public sentiment was overwhelmingly against Karen. Comments ranged from expressions of disgust at her classist attitudes to calls for the maximum possible sentence. Many people shared their own stories of encounters with entitled behavior, and Karen had become a symbol of everything people hated about wealthy privilege and its abuse. The media coverage was relentless and uniformly negative. Newspapers across Britain ran front-page stories about the incident, with headlines like "Privileged Wife's Palace Attack" and "When Entitlement Goes Too Far." Television news programs played the footage repeatedly, often accompanied by expert commentary about class privilege and social inequality. Richard Wellington watched the coverage from his office, fielding increasingly frantic calls from clients and business associates. Several major accounts had already indicated they were reconsidering their relationships with Wellington Financial Services. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting for that afternoon to discuss the crisis. "Richard," said Lord Pemberton, one of his most important clients, during a tense phone conversation, "I've known you for 15 years, and I've always respected your judgment. But this situation with your wife, it reflects on all of us. My family name cannot be associated with this kind of behavior." Richard tried to separate his professional reputation from his wife's actions, but he was discovering that in the interconnected world of British high society, that separation was impossible. Karen's behavior reflected on him, on his business, and on everyone associated with him. At the police station, Detective Inspector Rodriguez was preparing formal charges. The Crown Prosecution Service had reviewed the evidence and determined that the case should proceed to trial. The charge would be assault against a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces, which carried significantly more serious penalties than ordinary assault. Karen was finally beginning to understand the gravity of her situation when Rodriguez explained the charges and potential penalties. A conviction could result in up to 2 years in prison, a substantial fine, and a permanent criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. "This is insane," Karen protested. "I barely touched him. It was hardly even a slap." Rodriguez pulled up the security footage on her computer and turned the screen toward Karen. "Mrs. Wellington, this video clearly shows you striking Captain Morrison with significant force. There's visible blood on his face afterward. This wasn't a light tap. This was assault." For the first time since the incident, Karen was forced to truly confront what she had done. Watching herself on video was a shocking experience. She saw her own face contorted with rage, heard her own voice spewing classist insults, and witnessed herself striking a young man who had done nothing except stand silently at his post. I was having a bad day," she said weakly. "I wasn't myself." "Mrs. Wellington, having a bad day doesn't excuse assaulting someone. And your behavior in this video suggests a pattern of entitled attitudes and disrespect for people you consider beneath you." Simon Blackwood intervened before his client could make her situation worse. "Detective Inspector, my client is clearly distressed. Perhaps we could arrange for bail so she can return home while we prepare for trial." Rodriguez consulted her notes. Given the high-profile nature of this case and Mrs. Wellington's expressed attitude toward the victim, the Crown is requesting that bail be set at £50,000 with conditions. The conditions were strict. Karen would surrender her passport, report to police twice weekly, and have no contact whatsoever with Captain Morrison or any member of the palace staff. She was also forbidden from going within 1 mile of Buckingham Palace or any other royal residence. As the paperwork was being processed, Karen sat in stunned silence. The reality of her situation was finally penetrating the bubble of privilege that had protected her from consequences her entire adult life. She was going to trial for assault. Her name and face were known worldwide as symbols of entitled behavior. Her husband's business was suffering, and there was nothing she could do to make it go away. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, Karen would have to face the media circus that had erupted around her case. Reporters were already camped outside her home, eager to get additional footage or comments about the incident. When Richard finally arrived at the police station to post bail for his wife. He barely recognized the woman who emerged from custody. Gone was the confident, imperious Karen who had left their house that morning. In her place was a shaken, pale woman who seemed to have finally grasped the magnitude of what she had done. "Richard," she said as they walked toward their car through a gauntlet of reporters and photographers, "you have to fix this. You have to make this go away." Richard looked at his wife with a mixture of love and disappointment. "Karen, I can't fix this. What you did, it's all on video. The whole world has seen it. I can't make that go away. But you have connections. You know people. You've always been able to handle problems before. This isn't a business problem, Karen. This is a criminal matter. And you committed a crime in front of millions of witnesses. Money and connections can't change video evidence." As their car pulled away from the police station, Karen stared out the window at the protesters who had gathered to demand justice for Captain Morrison. Signs reading "Jail Karen" and "No privilege for assault" filled the street. For the first time in her life, Karen Wellington was facing consequences she couldn't buy, influence, or intimidate her way out of. The trial would reveal even more about Karen's character and behavior, and the British public's appetite for justice was only growing stronger. Captain Morrison had become a symbol of dignity under attack, while Karen had become the face of everything wrong with wealth and privilege. Justice was coming, and for once in her life, Karen Wellington would have to face it without the protective shield of money and connections that had always saved her before. The first palace security officer to reach the scene was Sergeant Michael Chun, a former Metropolitan Police detective who had been monitoring the situation from the Security Command Center since Karen first raised her voice. Chun had 20 years of experience dealing with difficult people, but he had never seen anything quite like what had just unfolded on the palace grounds. Chun approached with measured steps, his radio crackling quietly with updates from the command center. "Ma'am," he said politely but firmly, "I'm going to need you to step away from the guard and come with me, please." Karen spun around to face him, her eyes blazing with indignation. "Finally, someone with some sense," she said, gesturing toward James. "I want this guard reported immediately. His behavior has been completely unprofessional and unacceptable. I demand to speak with his supervisor right now." Sergeant Chin glanced at Captain Morrison, noting the blood on the young officer's cheek and the way he maintained his position despite what had just occurred. Chin had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles and understood the kind of discipline it took to maintain composure under assault. "Ma'am," Chin repeated, his tone becoming slightly more formal, "I need you to accompany me to the security office. There are some questions that need to be answered about what just happened here." "Questions?" Karen's voice rose to a near shriek. "The only question should be why this guard was being so deliberately rude and unprofessional. I am Karen Wellington. My husband is Richard Wellington of Wellington Financial Services. We are major donors to several royal charities, and I will not be treated like some common criminal." By now, additional security personnel had arrived on the scene. The tourists were being gently moved back to create a perimeter around the incident site, though many continued filming from a distance. Karen noticed the increasing security presence and seemed to interpret it as validation of her importance rather than recognition of her crime. "That's more like it," she said, smoothing down her suit jacket. "I assume you're here to escort me to my meeting. Though I must say, the security at this palace has some serious problems that need to be addressed. This guard's behavior was absolutely disgraceful." Detective Inspector Sarah Rodriguez had been summoned from the Metropolitan Police as soon as the assault was reported. Rodriguez was a 25-year veteran of the force who specialized in high-profile cases involving assault and domestic violence. She arrived at the palace gates just as Karen was finishing her latest tirade about James's supposed unprofessional behavior. Rodriguez introduced herself to Sergeant Chun and received a quick briefing on what had occurred. She reviewed the preliminary security footage on Chin's tablet, watching Karen's escalating verbal abuse culminate in the clear assault captured from multiple angles. "Mrs. Wellington," Rodriguez said, approaching Karen with professional calm, "I'm Detective Inspector Rodriguez with the Metropolitan Police. I understand there's been an incident here today, and I need to speak with you about what happened." Karen's demeanor immediately shifted. The presence of a detective gave weight to the situation that even she couldn't ignore. "Yes, There certainly has been an incident, she said, though her voice was slightly less confident than before. This guard was extremely rude to me, and I want him disciplined for his unprofessional conduct. I see, Rodriguez said, making notes in her pad. Can you walk me through exactly what happened from the beginning? Karen launched into her version of events, painting herself as the victim of James's alleged rudeness and unprofessional behavior. She described how she had politely asked for assistance, how he had deliberately ignored her, and how his attitude had forced her to become increasingly frustrated with his conduct. And then what happened? Rodriguez asked when Karen reached the point in her story where she had confronted James directly. Well, I tried to get his attention, Karen said, suddenly, becoming less specific. I made it clear that his behavior was unacceptable. How exactly did you make that clear? Karen hesitated for the first time since the incident began. I may have raised my voice slightly, and I might have gestured to emphasize my point. Rodriguez glanced at her tablet, where she could see the security footage clearly showing Karen striking James across the face. Is that all that happened, Mrs. Wellington? Just raised voices and gestures? Look, Karen said, her tone becoming defensive. If something physical happened, it was completely his fault. He was being deliberately provocative and disrespectful. Any reasonable person would have been upset by his attitude. So you're saying that something physical did occur? Karen realized she was walking into dangerous territory, but her pride and sense of entitlement wouldn't allow her to admit wrongdoing. If there was any contact, it was minimal and completely justified by his behavior. I barely touched him. Rodriguez made more notes, her expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Wellington, I'm going to show you some footage from the palace security cameras. I want you to tell me if this accurately represents what happened here today. She turned the tablet around so Karen could see the screen. The footage showed the entire encounter from beginning to end, capturing Karen's verbal abuse, her escalating aggression, and the moment when she struck James across the face with enough force to draw blood. Karen watched the footage in growing horror. On screen, she looked exactly like what she was, a privileged woman having a tantrum and assaulting a member of the military who was simply doing his job. The audio captured every word of her classist remarks, her threats, and her verbal abuse. This doesn't tell the whole story, Karen stammered. You can't see what led up to this. You can't see how rude he was being. Actually, Mrs. Wellington, our footage begins when you first approached the guard. We can see the entire encounter from multiple angles. Would you like to watch it again? Karen's face had gone pale beneath her expensive makeup. For the first time, she was beginning to understand that she might be in real trouble. I want to call my lawyer, she said quietly. That's certainly your right, Rodriguez replied. But first, I need to formally arrest you for assault. Karen Wellington, you are under arrest for assault upon a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. The words hit Karen like a physical blow. She had expected to be escorted to her charity meeting with perhaps a mild reprimand for the palace staff about their guards' behavior. She had not expected to be arrested, charged with a crime, or read her rights like a common criminal. This is ridiculous, she protested as Sergeant Chun produced handcuffs. You can't arrest me. Do you have any idea who my husband is? Do you know what kind of connections we have? Mrs. Wellington, Rodriguez said firmly. Your husband's connections don't change the fact that you committed assault in full view of multiple witnesses and security cameras. You struck a member of the Queen's Guard while he was performing his official duties. That's a serious crime regardless of who you're married to. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Karen finally began to comprehend the magnitude of her situation. The tourists who had witnessed the incident were still nearby, many still filming, capturing her arrest for posterity. Her perfectly styled hair was beginning to come undone. Her expensive suit was wrinkled from the stress of the confrontation, and her carefully applied makeup was smearing as tears of anger and frustration began forming in her eyes. This is a mistake, she said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. When my husband finds out about this, there will be consequences. Serious consequences for everyone involved. Rodriguez had heard similar threats countless times throughout her career. Wealthy suspects always believed their money and connections would save them. and they were usually shocked to discover that the law applied to them just as much as it applied to everyone else. Meanwhile, Captain Morrison remained at his post, though Colonel Harrison had finally arrived on the scene to assess the situation. Harrison was a career military officer who had served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan before taking command of the guard detail. He approached James with genuine concern. "Captain Morrison," he said quietly, "are you injured?" "No significant injuries, sir," James replied, speaking for the first time since the incident began. "Ready to continue my duties." Harrison examined the scratch on James's cheek and the slight swelling where Karen's hand had struck him. "I'm having you relieved of duty from medical evaluation," he said. "This assault needs to be properly documented, and you need to be examined by medical personnel." "Sir, that's not necessary. I can continue my post." "Captain, that's an order. You've been assaulted while performing your duties, and proper protocol must be followed. You'll be relieved immediately and escorted to medical for evaluation and documentation of your injuries." James nodded crisply. "Yes, sir." As Harrison signaled for James's relief to take his position, he felt a surge of anger at what had occurred. The Queen's Guard represented centuries of military tradition and honor. For a civilian to assault one of his men while they performed their ceremonial duties was not just a crime. It was an attack on everything the Guard represented. Karen was being escorted toward a waiting police vehicle when she caught sight of James being relieved of his post. Even in her current predicament, she couldn't resist one final comment. "See," she called out to the remaining tourists. "I told you he wasn't doing his job properly. Even his own superiors agree with me." Rodriguez shook her head in amazement. Even while being arrested for assault, Karen Wellington was trying to twist the situation to make herself look like the victim. In her 25 years of police work, Rodriguez had encountered many entitled suspects, but Karen was displaying a level of self-delusion that was truly remarkable. As the police car pulled away from Buckingham Palace with Karen in the back seat, the full weight of her situation was finally beginning to sink in. She was going to be booked, processed, and charged with a criminal offense. Her name would be entered into police records. The incident would be investigated. And, worst of all, there was video evidence of everything she had done. But, even as these realities began to dawn on her, Karen's first instinct was still to blame others. The Guard had provoked her. The police were overreacting. Her husband would fix this mess just like he had fixed every other problem she had encountered in her privileged life. What Karen didn't yet understand was that this time would be different. This time, her victim wasn't a service worker who could be intimidated into silence or a small business owner who could be bought off with money and threats. This time, she had assaulted a decorated war veteran who represented the crown itself. And the British public, when they learned what had happened, would not be nearly as forgiving as Karen expected them to be. The video footage of her assault was already beginning to spread across social media, shared by the tourists who had witnessed her tantrum. Within hours, millions of people would see exactly what kind of person Karen Wellington really was. The charity meeting she had been so determined to attend was canceled. Her position on the Princess Diana Memorial Fund Committee would be terminated before the day was over. And her husband, when he learned what she had done, would discover that even his considerable wealth and influence had limits when it came to protecting his wife from the consequences of her own actions. Justice was finally coming for Karen Wellington, and no amount of money or connections would be able to stop it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Captain James Morrison took his position at the northeast gate. At 28 years old, James stood 6 feet tall with the kind of bearing that came from years of military training and 3 grueling tours in Afghanistan. His red tunic was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, his bearskin hat positioned exactly as regulations demanded. To tourists passing by, he appeared to be nothing more than a ceremonial figure, a living statue placed there for their entertainment and photos. James had earned his position through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The son of a coal miner from Yorkshire, he had joined the army at 18 with dreams of serving his country. His natural leadership abilities and unwavering courage under fire had earned him rapid promotions and numerous commendations. The Queen's Guard was not just a ceremonial posting. It was one of the highest honors in the British military, reserved for only the most elite soldiers. As the morning progressed, tourists began gathering around the gates. James remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead, trained to ignore the cameras flashing and the endless chatter of visitors. This was part of his duty, part of what made the Queen's Guard legendary. No matter what happened around him, he would maintain his post with dignity and discipline. Karen Wellington emerged from her black Range Rover at precisely 10:15, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. At 45, Karen was the wife of a wealthy investment banker and had spent the last 20 years believing that money could solve any problem and that her husband's connections made her untouchable. She wore a cream-colored Chanel suit that cost more than most people earned in 3 months, and her perfectly styled blonde hair framed a face that had been enhanced by the finest plastic surgeon's money could buy. Karen had been having a terrible morning. Her personal assistant had quit via text message, her favorite restaurant had refused to accommodate her last-minute demand for a private dining room. And, worst of all, her husband had informed her that their planned vacation to the Maldives might need to be postponed due to some complications with his business. Karen was not a woman who accepted disappointment gracefully. She had come to Buckingham Palace for a charity event planning meeting, a prestigious committee position she had purchased through a substantial donation rather than earned through any genuine charitable work. The meeting had been scheduled for 10:30, but Karen had arrived early, expecting to be admitted immediately despite the strict security protocols that governed access to the palace grounds. When Karen approached the gate where James stood guard, she was already in a foul mood. She walked directly up to him, her designer purse swinging from her arm like a weapon, and stopped just inches from his perfectly polished boots. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "I need to get through this gate right now. I have an important meeting inside." James did not respond. His orders were clear. He was not to break his ceremonial stance except in cases of genuine emergency or direct orders from his commanding officers. Tourists often tried to engage the guards in conversation, and the proper protocol was to maintain complete silence and stillness. Karen waited exactly 10 seconds before her patience evaporated completely. "Are you listening to me?" she demanded, raising her voice loud enough that nearby tourists began turning their heads. "I am Karen Wellington. My husband is Richard Wellington of Wellington Financial Services. I am on the committee for the Princess Diana Memorial Fund, and I have a meeting inside this palace in 15 minutes. Still, James remained silent and motionless. His training had prepared him for far worse than an impatient civilian. During his time in Afghanistan, he had maintained his position under enemy fire, had watched friends die beside him, and had learned that true strength came from discipline and self-control. A wealthy woman's tantrum was hardly going to break his composure. But Karen interpreted his silence as deliberate disrespect. In her world, people jumped when she spoke. Shop assistants scrambled to help her, restaurant managers appeared instantly when she complained, and even traffic police had been known to tear up her tickets when she mentioned her husband's name and made a few strategic phone calls. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she announced to the growing crowd of onlookers. "This is what we pay taxes for. Guards who can't even do their jobs properly." She turned to a nearby tourist, a middle-aged woman from Germany, who was filming the exchange on her smartphone. "Can you believe this? These guards are supposed to be professional, but he's obviously just some working-class kid who doesn't understand who he's dealing with." The German tourist lowered her phone, clearly uncomfortable with being drawn into the confrontation. "Maybe he is not allowed to talk while he is working," she suggested quietly. "Nonsense," Karen snapped. "He's just being deliberately rude because he thinks he can get away with it." "Well, I've got news for him. My husband knows people who can get him fired with one phone call." James continued to stare straight ahead, though anyone watching closely might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. He had served his country with honor, had earned medals for valor, had seen things and done things that most people could never imagine. But his military training had also taught him the importance of following orders and maintaining discipline, even when faced with provocation. Karen's frustration reached a boiling point. She was not accustomed to being ignored, and certainly not by someone she viewed as a mere servant. In her mind, this young man in his fancy red uniform was nothing more than a glorified security guard, probably earning barely above minimum wage, certainly not deserving of the respect she felt he was withholding from her. She stepped even closer to James, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the faint aroma of the gin and tonic she had consumed during her car ride to the palace. "Listen to me, you little peasant," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "I don't know what kind of power trip you think you're on, but I am going through that gate whether you like it or not. My family has more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes, and I can make your miserable little existence even more miserable if you don't start showing me the respect I deserve." The tourists around them had gone completely silent. Even the most self-absorbed visitors could sense that something significant was happening. Smartphones appeared from pockets and purses as people began recording what they instinctively knew might become something worth remembering. James felt a muscle in his jaw twitch, but he maintained his position. His commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, had briefed the guard detail about dealing with difficult civilians. The protocol was clear: maintain composure, do not engage, and, if the situation escalated beyond verbal abuse, signal for backup using the discreet communication system built into their uniforms. But Karen wasn't finished. 20 years of having her way, of never facing real consequences for her behavior, had convinced her that she was essentially untouchable. Her husband's wealth had insulated her from accountability, his connections had made problems disappear, and her own sense of superiority had grown unchecked until she genuinely believed that rules applied to other people, not to her. "You know what?" she said, her voice rising again as she gestured dramatically with her hands. "I think you need a lesson in customer service. I think you need to learn what happens when you disrespect people who matter." She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, presumably to call her husband or one of his influential friends. But when she looked at the screen, she realized she had no signal inside the palace security perimeter, a deliberate security measure that she had no way of knowing about. The inability to make her threatening phone call was the final straw. Karen had built her entire adult life around the belief that she could solve any problem with money, connections, or intimidation. Faced with a situation where none of those tools worked, where she was forced to confront her own powerlessness, she snapped. "Fine," she snarled. "If you won't listen to reason, maybe you'll listen to this." Before anyone could react, before the tourists could process what was happening, before James himself could believe what was occurring, Karen drew back her right hand and struck him across the face with a sound that echoed off the palace walls like a gunshot. The slap was not a gentle tap or a theatrical gesture. Karen put her full strength behind it, her designer rings scraping across James's cheek as her palm connected with his face with enough force to turn his head slightly to the side. The crack of skin against skin seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. For a moment, absolute silence reigned. Even the pigeons seemed to stop cooing. The tourists stood frozen, their phones still recording but their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. A civilian had just struck a member of the Queen's Guard. A wealthy woman had just committed assault against a serving member of Her Majesty's military forces in front of dozens of witnesses and security cameras. James slowly turned his head back to center, his cheek already reddening from the impact. A thin line of blood appeared where one of Karen's rings had scraped his skin. But his expression remained completely neutral, his posture unchanged, his discipline absolute. Karen stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, her hand still raised as if she might strike again. The adrenaline of her action was coursing through her system, and, for just a second, she felt a surge of satisfaction. She had shown this arrogant guard what happened when people didn't treat her with proper respect. But, as the seconds ticked by and she saw the blood on his cheek, saw the absolute stillness of his response, saw the shocked faces of the tourists around her, a small voice in the back of her mind began to whisper that perhaps she had made a mistake. The German tourist who had tried to defuse the situation earlier was the first to break the silence. "Mein Gott," she whispered, her phone shaking in her hands as she continued recording. "She hit him. She actually hit him." Other voices began murmuring in the crowd. An American family stood slack-jawed, their teenage daughter posting frantically on social media. A Japanese businessman lowered his expensive camera, his face pale with shock. An elderly British couple exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their dismay at witnessing such a disgraceful scene. Karen suddenly became aware that everyone was staring at her. The satisfying surge of power she had felt moments before began to drain away, replaced by a growing sense of unease. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, tourists, palace staff members who had heard the commotion, and security personnel who were now moving purposefully in her direction. "He had it coming," she announced to the crowd, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. "Did you see how rude he was being? He completely ignored me when I was trying to ask a simple question. That kind of behavior is unacceptable from a public servant." But her words fell flat. The tourists continued staring, their expressions ranging from disgust to disbelief. A few people had already begun walking away, as if they wanted no part of whatever was about to unfold. James remained at his post, the blood from the scratch on his cheek beginning to dry. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, his breathing remained steady, and his hands stayed precisely positioned at his sides. To an outside observer, it might have seemed as though nothing had happened at all, except for the evidence of violence marking his face. What Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her assault on Captain James Morrison had been captured not just by tourist phones and cameras, but by the palace's sophisticated security system. Multiple high-definition cameras had recorded every moment of the encounter from different angles. Audio equipment had captured every word of her verbal tirade. And, perhaps most importantly, the entire incident had been witnessed by palace security personnel who were already moving to respond. The wheels of justice were about to begin turning, and, for the first time in her privileged life, Karen Wellington was about to discover that some consequences could not be bought, influenced, or intimidated away. What happens when an entitled woman mistakes a decorated royal guard for a regular security officer and decides to teach him a lesson with her fist? In the heart of London, outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, Karen Wellington thought she was dealing with just another minimum wage worker she could intimidate and abuse. She had no idea that the young man standing silently at his post was Captain James Morrison, a decorated war veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and held one of the most prestigious positions in the British military. The security cameras captured everything. The witnesses included tourists, journalists, and members of the royal household staff. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what would unfold in the days that followed Karen's moment of explosive rage. This isn't just a story about one woman's entitled behavior. It's about justice, consequence, and how one moment of violence would expose a web of privilege, corruption, and long overdue accountability. Karen thought she could strike a man in uniform and walk away. She thought wrong. What happened next would make international headlines and change laws forever.